Okay, and here we are live. Good morning to everybody who will tune in seconds into our LinkedIn live stream, Facebook live stream, and YouTube live stream, or listening to us in Clubhouse. It is a pleasure to have you with us this morning. It is Wednesday, August the 21st, and it is a beautiful midweek day here in Tokyo. I believe it is the same in Atami. And our special guest today, Samuel Gordon, is joining us from Singapore. So, Samuel, thank you very much for being with us, even though you're well in another
On the
part of
road.
yes,
Yeah.
on the road. Yes, thanks a lot for this. To everybody who hasn't met Samuel, still, we're going to talk about Japan at a pivotal change. And I would like to introduce Samuel very briefly before I give him the floor. So, Samuel is international tax and finance advisor and an international affairs commentator. And before I invite him to tell us about his Japan story and dive into the topic, I would like to do a brief introduction of one of our sponsors, our friends as well. So our first sponsor today is Kanchu.com. They offer bilingual services to individuals who want to buy and sell real estate in Tokyo and Yokohama. The company also does property management and investment property. To work with them in either English or Japanese, please reach out to James Howell at james@kanachu.com and connect with James on LinkedIn. So he's there and he'll be very happy to talk with you and see how they can help you solve your needs and meet your needs here, either in Yokohama or in Tokyo. So thank you very much for this. Samuel, once again, welcome. And the screen is yours. Let's start straight away.
Good morning, Maya and Tim, and everybody listening. Thanks for having me. Maybe I start, as you said, with a little bit of an introduction, a little bit of context for my Japan journey. I have been in Japan, lived in Japan longer than I often like to admit. I just say 20 years plus now whenever anyone asks. I live in
Right.
Tokyo with my family, but my journey started as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, where late 80s, so the Japan boom era, if you will, at least in terms of their investment into Japan. Fascinating time, a lot of trade tension, a lot of focus on the US-Japan relationship and the general media, and that kind of pushed me down a path where I was struck by the question of how was it that Japan was able to, in such a relative short time, redevelop, right, post-World War II, given really the physical devastation, right, that it had experienced as part of World War II. How was it that it was able to, or rise to the second largest economy in the world? And I took that on as an undergraduate, and that became a big part of my undergraduate thesis major. So studying the political economy and the economic development of Japan. From that, I said, well, I've done all this. I need to understand the language and culture a little bit more. So I like I would imagine a number of your guests. I then came to Japan on the JET program as my first entree into the country, and was in Fukuoka. Really, really enjoyed it. Was really struck by it, and then I went back to graduate school and got some what I would say hard skills, some things from my toolkit that allowed me to enter into the professional space that I have been in now for the better part of 25 years, and that is advising primarily multinational on around their Japan businesses. And then as I've gotten further in my career, not just Japan, but their APAC group businesses, which brings me to Singapore. Um, and but even through all of that, I've continued to have the same interest, that same thing that kind of sparked my interest in Japan. How is it? Why was it? Right? Both
Yeah.
the history, the political context, the economics of it, the intrigue of it have always been a big part of how I've kind of taken on my life and work in Japan.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for that. And I appreciate you mentioning about your interest in Japan because we meet a lot of people here who come to Japan for different reasons.
Yeah.
And I have seen this a lot. You know, we all have a different story here in Japan, and our kiai with the country is
Yeah.
right. It is a different one for every one of us. But then I often hear also that people come here for example, for the animation or for the music
Mm-hmm.
or architecture and so on. And you mentioned that you have always been interested in the country because of how it was and why it was that way.
Right.
But well, has your Japan story given you the answers to these questions?
That's a good question, right? I think it has given me it gave me a context for understanding how institutions and then the people within institutions in Japan work, right? A
Right.
starting point for that, and it did validate a lot. I think it also gave me the sort of context to sort of see how we look at Japan in the present, right? A dynamic present, how it deals with change and how it deals with the rest of the world around it, right? It's given me that, right? So I feel like that's important. And then I always say my second hometown in Fukuoka has given me a love for things like shochu and mintaiko and and all of the
Mhm.
other things that that are part of what I think to be my Japanese life, if you will. So yes, it has contributed both to my learning, and it expanded. It brought the cultural side and to me that when I started, that wasn't really an element of it, right? It was more of an academic um,
Yeah.
curiosity, and now it is just as much a cultural and linguistic curiosity as it is an academic or professional curiosity.
To that
Right.
point, because you did mention you stayed in Fukuoka and then you fell in love with it, and that perked my ears up because some of us
Yeah,
had similar, not in Fukuoka necessarily, but
yeah.
for whatever reason, we fell in love with it. In your case, what specific? I mean, you mentioned Mentaiko. I'm a big fan too. But in your case, like, what was so endearing that made you fall in love with it and really want to come back and stay?
Yeah, I think it was probably two or three things. The one was um, the the friends and the people that I met, right,
Mhm.
have been
Yes.
really dear friends. Right, there's a
Yep.
certain demure, there's a certain shyness, there's a certain also sort of linguistic thing you have to bridge at times, right? But even through all of that, right, the sincerity and the trueness of the friendships that I've had over more than 30 years now.
Yeah.
People in Fukuoka who I'm still in touch
More
with.
than 20. Come on, more than 20.
That's been such an important part of it, right? As you would imagine. The other
Yeah.
is, it is truly a lovely place in terms
Yeah.
of lifestyle, in terms of quality of life, right? Um, those two things combined, I think, have been a big part of it.
Yeah, that makes total sense because it was the human side. That's how it was
Yeah.
for me. I know that's how it was for Maya. And
Yeah.
some people don't have that much trouble figuring out how to connect, and
Mhm.
Yeah.
some people struggle with it.
Yeah.
And so what I'm hearing from you is it was kind of a natural. I mean, I'm sure we all had challenges, right? But there's
Yeah,
something, you know.
I think that's an interesting point, and it taps into maybe how I also work with my colleagues. I come from I'm from the U.S. I'm a mix of a West Coast guy and a Southern guy. Is the way to
Mm-hmm.
think about it. The
Yeah,
Southern guy in me is very accustomed to yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir,
yeah, yeah,
certain hierarchies,
yes,
right? And that has always been a part of my life. And so when I came to Japan, and that element of it that sometimes is hard for people to kind of adjust to, I didn't have an issue
right,
with.
right,
Was
right.
was very my grandmother was and drilled that into me many years ago.
Yeah. I lived in the South for 5 years. I lived in Tennessee.
Excuse me.
And I'm from Chicago.
Okay.
Which is totally different culture. And of course, I'm the Yankee from the North, right? But my Japanese wife and friends really loved it.
Yeah.
And there was this softness, like, the Southern hospitality, but there was also an indirectness in the way they communicate relative to Chicago and New York, and Boston, right? And so I see that, like I see overlap in the cultures. And a lot of my Southern friends who came here, just like you said, kind of adapted pretty easily maybe for that reason. That's interesting.
Yeah. I think there's elements that are shared, and that's always something to look for whenever you live and travel, right? To see the shared humanity, right? Is really important, I think, in terms of how you journey through the world, if you will.
Yes, and it so happens that we have so many more similarities than differences. Because listening to both of you talking about the south of the States, and I think back about home, and I also remember that I was brought up to show respect to the people who are older than me, and when I came to Japan, it was so very natural. So I didn't feel any stress because of this. Of course, there were different things, that were stressful, but at least in this regard, there was absolutely nothing for me, nothing new to get used to.
And just to be fair and keep the conversation nuanced, it was a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, when I came here, I was looking for common things. Oh, they like rock and roll. Oh, they have McDonald's. Oh, they like the blues. Like I'm zeroing in, and that's a beautiful thing. That's that's what's great about art and music, right? But I was also unconsciously projecting my own biases onto them without knowing it. And we all have our own values, and we're swimming in it, so we don't see our own values. But when you think about truth and honesty and frankness and freedom of speech and everybody's equal and all these things that many Americans take for granted as a given are not necessarily embraced by the culture you're dealing with. And yet, I found myself, it took me a while and I figured it out, but I was projecting those. So that was the downside. Like I was almost assuming too much commonality, right? And it's a nuanced thing,
It is.
Right.
And maybe we are all guilty of that at the same time, because naturally yes, I mean, when we see a person in front of us, we think that we're, like we share the same things and we were brought in the same way, but well, it happens that we weren't. And yes.
Yeah. But it's an awareness that hopefully you develop over time, right? And but I also think that going back to that, the friendships, right? That's one thing that I can say, despite all of what we're talking about now, right? Those you can, the depth of friendship and the sincerity that you encounter is something that is really, really, moving, right? And so those things have been probably most important to me over time, I would say.
Yeah, me too. I agree.
Yeah.
So that's what culture is. It's about the relationships you build with people. I guess that's how we boil it down to that, right?
That's right. That's right.
So. And also, it is very true in business, because I think that we always think when we talk about relationships, we envision our everyday life and how we do within our family circle, relative circle, friend circles, and so on. But it's so very true in business too. And I think that people just do not realize how much culture shapes business practices and everything. And we're seeing that at the moment, Japan is at a very crucial point. So things are changing, relationships are changing, and businesses are changing. Politics is changing too. So everything is changing, and so I think that we are going to talk about this today too, Samuel. So maybe we can transition into this topic.
Perfect segue.
Yes.
Sure. No, I mean, and thanks for that. Maya and Tim, I think when we first talked about doing this, a few months back, we said, we've seen it over the last even year or more, right? That the pace at which change is coming, and the change that Japan has to deal with, right, is
Yeah.
increasing. And it's funny, I'd say even more so in the last month or so. If we just pick up a couple of data points, starting from recent, right? Shida-san and the Prime Minister and his announcement that he will not stand for, Prime Minister in the upcoming elections. The really, really big, very volatile movement in the Nikkei just a few weeks ago. I mean, a downward movement in value that was akin to the Black Monday, and but also a bounce back, relatively big bounce back on that. A breaking of what seemed like a forever period of the yen the yen dollar value above 150 yen, down into the 140 range. Still very volatile, but a downward trend being visible. The Bank of Japan announcing, increase in interest rates. These are just kind of tip of the iceberg type of items, right? But they represent this really pickup in momentum of change that is, from a business standpoint, are factors quite often, factors that are external, meaning things that contribute to business that business has to deal with. I think the Nikkei movement, in particular to the finance world, is very specific to investment and the appeal of investment, the movement of the yen, or the movement of into dollars and out of yen, those kinds of things. So these things, these kind of technical, sometimes difficult to understand factors are part of it. But as you said, business in the end is really a human endeavor. And so at the same time, we're seeing a lot of change that involves people and mindset and motivation and behavior, right? And for example, the biggest one we're seeing, and this has been building for some time, you guys may be aware of it, there is clearly more of a, what's the right word? There's more of a focus, a priority, that management, so people, are putting on return on investment. So decisions that are being made at a senior level in companies and how they view things. There's Japan I don't think will ever become a pure shareholder capitalism place, but the relative weight of shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism is definitely changing, right?
Right.
It's evident, and that's a behavioral change. The first thing is someone is deciding to place more emphasis on a different priority, right? That then moves an organization and people in a way. So I think, when we start to talk about pivotal change, right? These are some of the data points that you can point to, and we'll probably talk about others through the conversation, but these are some of the ones that you can point to that says, okay, given that, how then is this human endeavor of business in Japan changing, right? And how are people, individuals, faced with that change, or dealing with it, either, as I think in the little title, change and chance, right? So the opportunity, right, going forward. So this is kind of where we are, I think, as we and this is maybe just a level set as we go further in the conversation.
Yeah.
I don't know if you all have any comments, or you all observe the same thing.
Tim, your mic.
I'm sorry, the cicadas, I told them to shut up, but they won't listen. So I muted myself so the cicadas wouldn't be invading.
They want to join the conversation.
Yeah, right. It's really hard recording music because they want to be part of the chorus. But so to people who are not well versed maybe in upper management business, Could you explain in simple terms, like, what is the significance of the shareholder versus stakeholder remark that you made, so people understand it? Is there some concrete example of how that might manifest in a certain way, for example?
Yeah. I mean, it's first. Let maybe start by just definitions, right? So that I think, when we think about shareholder capitalism, the definition of it kind of comes out of corporate finance, which is to maximize the value of a firm. And maximizing value effectively means, for ease of focus and practical reasons, the equity, right, of a firm. So that is and that, when you, and the easiest example of it, or the most, and it's not true. No place is on a. It's all of this is on a spectrum, right?
Right.
But the U.S. is quite often thought of as a shareholder capitalism, and the best example, one of the best examples of the way you can kind of pick up on that is if you've ever heard the term creative destruction, right? This whole issue of okay, capital is not being used properly or well, or earning the right return in a particular business or a particular industry. Capital over time will be reduced, right? In those sectors, and be reallocated to other parts of the economy, other sectors, right? And it's a cold sounding thing, because all of this is nowhere in this have we said anything about people. Right? It's capital, right? But that is at one end of the spectrum, the shareholder capitalism. The stakeholder capitalism is much more something that, you think about it, right? Any given firm will have multiple key stakeholders. Those equity owners are clearly a major stakeholder. Holders of debt are a major stakeholder. Employees are major stakeholders. Suppliers are major stakeholders. Customers are a major stakeholder. The state, and when I use the state, civil society, those who parts of the society that may bear certain costs that are not necessarily reflected on the income statement of a company, environmental costs, societal costs, those kinds of things. So society as well, right? So stakeholder capitalism tends to place, or it doesn't necessarily completely deprioritize the equity owners, but it places more priority on some of the other types. And if you go back in history in Japan, right, particularly to the harkening of modern Japan, the zaibatsu, the zaibatsu and the keiretsu, those types of institutions or organizations where cross shareholding between suppliers, banks who are really debt holders, right, and customers, right, created a balance, if you will, right. So Japan has always been probably more on along the spectrum. You think of these things as being two ends of the spectrum. Japan has probably, in many instances, been more on the stakeholder end of the spectrum. Japan has some of the largest capital markets in the world, right? It's not to suggest they aren't, concerned about this and haven't been concerned about a return on equity and other things. But in the balance of things relative to, maybe the standard definitions and it's one of its biggest trading partners, the U.S., it's been thought of as more on the stakeholder end of capitalism.
Gotcha. So I can, to me, it makes sense that a collectivist culture would find appeal in the stakeholder model. And again, I agree, it's on that spectrum. So it kind of makes sense. And I think also part of it maybe is a longer term focus of a sustainable focus in the real sense of the word, right?
That's right. When I mentioned that whole thing about me and my interest in why and how Japan grew over the post-World War II period, this was a big part of it, right? The importance of full employment, right? The importance of deep relations, long-term relationships with suppliers and customers and banks, right? These kinds of things that would allow, um, firms that were very challenged. I mean, old firms that were very challenged that came out of World War II, new firms that came out post World War II, to find a place in a society and to grow, right, as the society itself started to grow and advance. So this was a part of that dynamic as well.
Yeah, and it was funny. A friend of mine, a Japanese guy, he made the observation that, and I know it's weaker now, but the cross holdings within the Keidetsu, like people owned each other's stock. He said, Tim, that they took a page out of feudalism. So
Yes.
I hold your brother hostage, and you hold my brother hostage, and we keep each other in check to make sure it's like forced cooperation by creating those conditions. And so he said it was very feudalistic in nature, which I thought was an interesting
Tim, tell your friend I will have to borrow that one for conversations going forward. That is a very easy way to make it. The leave my brother or my child with you and I take yours is a very, very easy way for people to understand it, right? Yeah. But this is, these are the kinds of things that, this Japan is at an inflection point. I mean, it's going to continue to be on that spectrum, right? And it's probably never going to, hopefully in a way, never become just a complete, equity or shareholder capitalism oriented society, right? But it is, again, on that spectrum, it's kind of reconfiguring itself. Yeah.
2-minute warning. No, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we know why you have we heard the alarm, right? So it is time.
Right.
Yes, thank you, Tim, for setting the alarm. And
we're high tech here.
Yes, thank you for giving us the chance, to introduce our other sponsor. So, before we continue, we're in the middle of the podcast, and I would like to say thank you very much to Houze Inc. and Hannah Howell. So Houze Inc. offers also bilingual services in custom home design, construction, and renovation, plus commercial building construction. If you are thinking about any projects in these fields, please connect with Hannah Howell on LinkedIn, or go to the home page of Houze Inc. and contact them. Either Japanese or English will be fine, because the company works in the two languages, so you do not have to worry about the communication with them. Thank you very much, Houze Inc., and thank you very much, Hannah. So it has been a pleasure to work with you, and we'll continue. Yes.
Wow.
Okay. Yes. So I wanted to going back to the topic about stakeholders and shareholders. I think that there is that actually what's that narrowing the gap, between stakeholder and shareholder capitalism, because Samuel, as you mentioned, so Japan is moving a little bit. It's moving slowly towards shareholder capitalism, but I think that other parts of the world, especially the Western world, is moving slowly towards the Japanese model.
That's right. Good.
And I very much hope that Japan will never be a full-blown shareholder capitalism, capitalist country, because we can see that when we have that, we can expect quite a few things happening that do not benefit the society per se.
That's right.
Right, but of course, once again, we have the positives and negatives. So hopefully, Japan will keep more of the positives and move forward. But what are some other points, that actually we can observe, or we are observing right now at this point?
Yeah, I think there has been a long. I mean, in this kind of what we talked about, the business thing. If we also put it into context of the biggest thing that we always hear about Japan, the aging of society. one of the things that is, how do these two things kind of come together? Or what's the connection there? One of them is that when we think about pensions, when we think about the funding of post-work lives in Japan, that aspect of things, right, and the idea of Japan basically getting more value out of its assets for that objective, right, is a major part of what we're seeing. And there are two or three things in that I'm observing. One is, and you guys may be familiar with this, maybe some of the other guests have spoken about it. Going back a couple of years ago, the Tokyo Stock Exchange said if your first tier listed share, there is an expectation of greater transparency and disclosure with respect to your targets around return on equity, return on investment, and what you're doing to move towards those targets, which is, again, it's intended to spark a certain behavior, right? Going back to that point, business seems like it's all institutions, but in the end, it is very much a behavior choice-driven, human choice-driven thing. So in that's the first thing. And those are at the base level, the most common assets that are held, or one type of very common asset that gets held by pension funds, by investors to fund retirement, to fund education, to fund all of the things that a healthy society feels the need to endeavor in, right? So that's one. The other aspect of this is, alongside of that, there have been a number of changes that are really oriented towards, okay, if you want to be able to improve the return on investment, that means you also need to be able to do certain things that allow you to allocate assets, allocate funding in a better way. One thing we see is that the merger and acquisition market in Japan is, there are certain policy changes, some tax, some legal, that are making it a lot easier for firms to sell off parts of their business they feel are underperforming, acquire parts that they think they have synergies with that makes it, they can grow to scale better, or they can operate at scale better. So the idea of piecing business together, of turning over certain assets, right, into the market, is picking up and improving. The thing you'll hear a lot about in the media, of course, is the increase in private equity activity. That forms just one type, I would say, of asset reallocation. There are a number of other types, right? But that is important to go along with this. If you expect big companies to improve their return on investment, then that by definition means you also expect them to deal with some of their lagging businesses and figure out better ways to address the asset allocation in that. So that is a big thing, right? And then the last thing is, I think there has been a change in, we're starting to see it, I think, with the NISA, the introduction of NISAs, which are, effectively the kind of, in the U.S. terminology, kind of approaching retirement investment type of IRA type of products, meant to be tax effective individual investment products that will help individuals, or will point individuals towards allocating what typically had been bank savings, right? Predominantly bank savings, some in insurance products, but allocating that more to other types of assets, whether they be investment trusts that are made up of equity or bonds, or directly investment in equity and bonds. So these NISAs and these types of products are really, really oriented towards changing the mindset and the behavior of Japanese as individual investors, to go alongside all of the other changes and what's occurring in these massive government pension funds, right? So that's the other side of this from a business standpoint. And again, you think about the things I mentioned. all of them are geared towards really making behavioral changes. The first one is, hey, management, we have to make a decision to prioritize return on investment in a way that we maybe haven't before. We have to figure out then, what kind of goes down another level, and how does this come up in terms of our priorities, right? The second one, the M&A, and I think even we've seen with 7-Eleven in the last few days, right? The talk about them and them underperforming and how they may be subject to acquisition. And whether it's good or bad is something for other people to maybe talk about. But the idea that, okay, there is a real earnest conversation being had about, are those assets being used in the most effective way, right? That's a good conversation. The way it has to occur in Japan is, to Tim's point on how things get communicated and how frank people maybe want to be is one thing, but the idea that it is occurring is again something that people are behind, right? And then the last one, the NISAs are also, it's individuals who are changing their behavior. So these are the other kinds of things I think that are very evident, right, in terms of what we see.
Tim, your mic.
You and the cicadas you and the cicadas.
On behalf of the cicadas, moshiwake gozaimasen. There was also a garbage truck just out my door, so at least that's gone on the bright side, right? So the Japanese have this way of doing things and surviving situations that seems to come out of nowhere to some other countries, right? Like they adapt sometimes in what I think are surprising ways to an outsider.
Yep.
Right? Do you see any of those surprises coming?
I think one, and I don't know where it's going. It's a very good point. I mean, there's this idea of, and maybe you guys have heard about it, right? There's been a lot of study in behavioral science of late, meaning the last 15 years, but to start to think about, okay, the impact of culture on business, and there's this framework that really looks at a spectrum of tight versus loose cultures, right?
Yeah.
Japan is always thought of as a tight culture, i.e., very, very a high degree of conformity around certain aspects of the culture, right? Not everything, but certain aspects, right? An importance placed on certain amount of consensus, right, as part of the culture, as opposed to free-mindedness or independent-mindedness, right? So this idea of the tight culture, and it obviously plays itself out in business as well, right? So the way decision making occurs, right? This whole idea of, anyone who knows or has been associated with big Japanese companies, it's very, very hard to understand how decisions get made, but lo and behold, there's a consensus decision that has been made, right? And that has to do with the mawashi and the way the hierarchy of things work. I think, Tim, that the idea that Japan will continue to have a tight culture won't change, but what a tight culture means, is changing.
Right.
And how it manifests in business, that is changing.
Changing together often.
Yes.
Exactly.
And just to that point, because Maya and I have had this discussion, because we started hearing the word tight culture, right? And then Maya looked at what I have this representation bell curve of Japanese, how they tend to behave in certain situations. And if you look at, it's theoretical, but it's a very tight bell curve.
Yeah.
And the average tends to be pretty high. The average, right? But the high and lows seem to be tighter, not because of ability, but sometimes because the culture tends to limit people, right?
Yeah.
But overall, and so Maya once made the remark, Tim, your bell curves kind of are a visual representation of what a tight culture is. Your thoughts on that?
I think that's a good way to think about it, right? Because the point of it is right, the number of observations and the distance from that central mean, right, or average in the middle, is going to be higher, right? As opposed to the distribution out across the tail, right? They're still out there, but there's fewer of them, right?
Right.
Exactly.
I think that
Yeah.
that is I don't know if empirically they've looked at it that way, but it's definitely when you read and you understand how this framework has been thought about, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely an element of it, right?
Yeah.
And versus all cultures have all types,
They
right?
do.
So that's just the human nature, the individual human nature. But it's the frequency, it's how it gets expressed,
Yeah.
the situations in which it occurs, right? That is probably more at issue, and that bell curve or the distribution you mentioned is a good way to kind of fix it in your mind how Japan is at the tight end of the spectrum.
I wonder, what do you think? Because, well, Japan actually is experiencing a shortage of labor, right, for
Yes.
working hands, and
Mm-hmm.
so they do need, and they have started actually letting more foreigners in,
Yep.
even though it is not officially announced. It is not
Yep.
well, the news and whatever, but we know that it is happening.
Yep.
And we get more foreigners in the workforce. We also are getting more women in the workforce.
Yep.
So I
Mm-hmm.
personally believe that because of these two additions to the workforce, the bell curve will eventually spread out, and probably the average will become a little bit lower. But
Yep.
I wondered whether what your take on this is, because I expect that to happen, but I may be mistaken. So I wonder whether your take is similar or if it's a different one.
And
When,
before you answer, Samuel, real quick, Maya and I have also talked about, yes, there's that bell curve that's very tight, but that's the Tatemai bell curve. That's the performative
Yes.
bell curve.
That's right.
And then there's the Hone,
Right.
and I would hypothesize that that's much
It may
more
be a little
widely
broader.
spread out, but you gotta
That's right.
conform, which goes back to your
Conforming. Conforming. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think, man, it's interesting, and I think, Tim, we can kind of bring these 2 points together. You raise an interesting point in terms of the diversity of the folks that are now finding themselves in the workplace in Japan, and even to a certain degree, that's starting to be in a limited fashion, starting to be reflected in the leadership of companies,
yeah,
right? Representative leadership, right? So yes, I think those two things will play a factor. I believe the thing that I think though is playing a really really big factor though, and this is if you think about all of us who've been here a long time. We are very familiar with the culture of, basically you stay until your boss leaves.
hmm
There's this sort of unwritten rule around, hey, the FaceTime and work, etc. Irrespective of productivity, right? If you think about how quickly that changed with COVID, think about how quickly that element of how it was forced to change, but how quickly it changed. I think about my experience with some of my colleagues who found that to be extremely challenging in the initial period of COVID, right? They found it very, I mean, part of it is that, they maybe they're not set up to work from home. There's a lot of factors involved. If you jump forward to now, right, you have a clear, uh, how would I put it? You have a lot of clarity. People are their desire. People who want to work from home will state that they want to work from home.
right.
People will move. I mean, HR now knows that this is in effect a type of benefit. We're post COVID, but the flexibility is
hmm
something that in any HR program in Japan, right, they are really intent on making sure that that is an element of what they put forward as part of their, as much as they can, given the nature of the business, as part of how they, what they offer their employees, right? That is a massive change. It's a massive change, right? Because, there's a couple of things, like if you think about it, right, you still have the typical need to create a certain type of culture, a corporate culture. That
Right.
is
Yeah.
much more challenging to do in a digital and in a hybrid environment than it was when everybody was in the office all the time, and you could just gather everybody on the floor and do whatever you needed to do. So I think the combination of what you mentioned plus this idea that the way working is occurring is changing is also going to have an impact on that bell curve. The way working is occurring is also, interestingly enough, it involves choice in a way that maybe Japanese folks in the labor market maybe hadn't experienced before. This whole idea we've seen over the last 30 years, the concept of lifetime employment.
Hmm.
While it is still there, it is not as prevalent as it once was.
Right.
It's right,
Yeah.
and
Right.
so that has also meant
Exactly.
that you've seen people move towards more of a skill-based mindset as opposed to an organizational-based mindset when they think about their career development. Right, skills that are transferable. Right, all of these
Portable
things I think
skills. Yeah.
are converging. Right, in a
Mhm.
way
Yeah.
and are converging in a way that will create, I think, a bit more diversity and dynamism, right, in terms of
Right.
the human talent side, right, which then feeds into business change, right, because change in part is driven off of the experience and the types that are involved in making business decisions.
Yeah, it seems to me that the Japanese often are reluctant to jump into something that's crazy new.
Yep,
But once it's thrust upon them,
that's it.
I think they're really good at adapting to the reality, at least in my experience.
Well, I mean
Yeah.
that is. I think it's a DNA thing because you think about the
Yeah,
history of Japan, right? And at different points in time, right, when Japan has had to make big
black
changes,
ships.
they've
Yeah,
changed. They've changed in a really, really, surprisingly. I mean,
yeah,
people, when people who aren't familiar with Japan, Japan seems like it doesn't change. It doesn't. I always harken back to these things because to me that's
Yeah.
part of the DNA of
Yeah.
Japan,
yeah.
right? When it does decide to change and do something, and they
Yeah.
have
It
they
changes.
hit that tipping point in terms of consensus, it changes quickly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to make a point, and I've made it before on the show about consensus because I think that term is misunderstood. Okay.
Mm,
Hmm.
And so I was very fortunate. My very first boss was a master at Nemawashi. I didn't even
mm,
know that word at the time, but I was the interpreter for him. So he brought me along for the ride every time he did Nemawashi. And eventually I figured out what he was doing. Right.
right.
And as I observed him, I felt like I misunderstood what consensus meant. Okay. And I thought it meant everybody's going to agree on the final
Mm,
decision. And that's
mm,
not what it meant. What
Yes.
it meant was everybody is going to agree that, yes, indeed, this is the current situation.
yep.
And the way you get them to agree is you go to them and ask them to help you define the current situation and you
Mm,
show them what you have from the other department's point of view. And now you add yours and you bring it into this big, here's the issue, here's the concern.
right.
And years later, I read Drucker, Peter
Mm,
Drucker, and he said, when Japanese and Westerners speak of, quote, making a decision, in the West, it's always about coming up with the right answer to the question.
Hmm.
However, in Japan, the consensus part is coming up with the right question and getting everybody to agree on the question. But it doesn't mean everybody's going to be happy with the answer, but they will appreciate being part of defining the problem. But in the end, somebody's going to be unhappy. Does
yeah.
that kind of make
Yeah.
sense?
It's interesting because I hadn't thought about that, but it does, and I think to some of the ways, some of the strategies. I was having a conversation with a client who is trying to who is making a move of remotely managing certain aspects of their Japanese operations. Um, they had somebody on shore. They're moving away from that model for certain for certain things, right? and I was talking to them about how, okay, the technical side of this will probably be relatively easy, right? But the thing you mentioned, the point around having a shared interest
Mm-hmm.
and what is, with those people who are on the ground, who you are dependent on for information, for process, for various things, right, is going to be critical. So I what you just described, right, the Malashi thing, I think it extends not just to change, it extends to figuring out a way to get people to work together in the most effective way, right? So it's a great way to think about it. And I hadn't thought about, and that the whole issue definition thing, right? Like we said, Japan in the past, when it's been faced with a major issue that it has to deal with, it makes change. So that, from their standpoint, that first, well, are we dealing with an issue that requires change
Yeah.
has to be well established. So Tim, I think that's a great way to think about it.
Mm. To the point, we have been mentioning change quite a lot, during the past 5 or 10 minutes. And as you mentioned, Samuel, the general perception of Japan is that Japan doesn't change and Japan doesn't like changes. But I think that once again, to the point that Tim made, about consensus, there is the principle applies to the way we view change, the
Yeah.
way change is viewed in Japan and how it is viewed out of Japan in the Western world. Because when in the Western world, when we say change, it means something really drastic, something
Yeah.
big,
Yeah.
And here in Japan, change is not that. Of course, there are such changes like that, when there is nothing else to do but accept new rules, change rules, and so on. It happens. It happens in times of natural disasters. It happens in times of similar to COVID and so on. But change is here. It's a constant thing for the Japanese, and those incremental changes, Kaizen itself is change, like when you try to improve things, it means that you're changing them for the better.
Yeah.
So I think that we basically need to know that change is framed and seen as something different here in Japan as compared to the United States or in Europe. So,
Yeah.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. Yeah, it definitely. And again, I think to Kim's earlier point about consensus or defining the issues, right? I mean, change here is quite often, we think of it as incremental, right? But when you when you think about how these things compound over time, right?
yeah,
That is where you get to big change, right, in Japan,
right,
right?
yes.
And yeah, and business has been. I mean, there has been a lot of change that has been occurring over the last 10, 15 years. That now, and I honestly think now that as we enter into a new environment, financial markets wise for Japan,
Hmm.
right? These things hopefully will come together in a way, right? The behavior and the markets will come together in a way that will really help Japan kind of move into a new period. And we haven't even talked about the geopolitics and the opportunity that
Right.
the geopolitical
Mm,
environment that Japan finds itself in, how that is, that's also spurring
yeah.
a great deal of change as well.
Yeah, I would love to talk about the geopolitical environment, how it is actually impacting Japan and the business in Japan in another session, Samuel, if
Mm,
you don't mind, because I think it's a topic that deserves a separate
yeah,
conversation.
yeah,
And
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
yeah,
The only thing I would say about it, though, just to kind of tease it out, and then we can take it to, is that we are, if you think, I mean, for anyone who knows what the post World War II dynamism with respect to how Japanese corporates were able to go out into the world
oh
and
yeah,
build their presence in foreign markets,
hmm,
we there is a possibility that we may be entering into history. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
it
So
rhymes,
we
yes.
may be entering into a period of history rhyming, is the way I would put it. Because
way.
I mean, the dynamic that the geopolitical dynamic is in that respect is very similar. And I think Japanese government, the DNA, they have enough historical memory to appreciate that and to
Yeah,
drive policy in a
yeah.
way that will be hopefully oriented towards the betterment of Japan in that
Mhm.
sense.
Yes. Well, that's
Wow.
going to be a fascinating
Yeah.
topic in the conversation too,
Yeah.
because yes, I think that only thanks to the pandemic, the majority of people realized how important geopolitics are.
Yes.
Because before that, of course, people working in business, they had an idea, and those who were impacted by geopolitics, they were more aware of that. And now I think that the percentage of the general population that is aware
Yep.
of geopolitical impact on domestic business has
Yep.
increased, has expanded. And that's why I think that we should dedicate a separate session on
Happy
this.
to. Happy
Yes.
to.
Right
Happy to have
on.
that
That'd be
conversation.
great.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I enjoyed today's conversation. It was really good. It was
Great.
fun. Thank
No,
you.
it's good. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And the
Yeah.
Yes.
Cicadas enjoyed it too. They had a blast.
Yes. Well, thank you so very much. Yes, Samuel, I appreciate your time. I know that you are on the road, and still you kept your promise to be with us today. And it was a great
Thank
conversation.
you very much.
Well, let's continue it in
Yeah.
a month or so. Of course, it depends on your schedule too. But well, the invitation is open, and I will be contacting you, to
Yeah.
so
Great.
that we can schedule the next one. Thanks a lot, really. And now, so well, this is
Close
time
out with our sponsors. Yes, our very
very important. Let me
right.
once again say thank you very much to Kanachu.com, Kanagawa Chuo Jutaku, and James Howell, and also Houze Inc. and Hana Urushisawa Howell. Thank you both, the companies and the individuals that drive them. It has been a pleasure working with you, and to anybody who hasn't connected with James and Hannah yet, please reach out to them on LinkedIn, because even if you're not in need to buy or sell property or home design, not now, maybe next year or in 2 years you might need them. So remember, James and Hannah and Kanachu.com and Houze Inc. Thanks a lot for this. And again, so Samuel, it has been a pleasure having you with us today. Thank you very
Thank you
much
so
for the
much.
insightful conversation,
Yeah.
and we'll be together again,
Yeah.
hopefully in a
Yeah.
month or so.
Thank you, Samuel.
Thank you
Please
guys as
come
well.
back.
Have a good rest of the day, and yeah, and I look forward to picking up on the conversation some point in the future.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody, for listening.
Thank you.